Welcome to our Power to the People Energy Poverty and Retrofitting webinar, part of the Friends of the Earth Learning Hub for 2022. This is an ongoing series looking at various global justice themes and deepening our understanding of them through shared discussion, reading, watching and listening. This year the series has explored activism, the arts, eco-poetry, graphic design for grassroots movement, and for next month we'll be delving into navigating climate anxiety. But for this month's sessions, we're doing two learning hubs looking at the topics of energy poverty and retrofitting with this webinar, and the next follow-up workshop will be 2 weeks from now. So tonight we're delighted to welcome Issy Petrie from the Society of St. Vincent de Paul, Bulani Mfaiko from Mazi and Equinox, Claire O'Connor from Friends of the Earth, and Bryce Goodall from Living Rent in Scotland. So I'd like to actually start with a couple questions to our attendees before we go over to our speakers. So I'm going to put a link in the chat. I know not everyone is on a device that can open up. For any of you who can open up this, link going in the chat now, that will take you to a Menti poll there. Maybe someone can give me a thumbs up if you're able to see that there. So this brings you to a question. And that question is, it asks you to list these topics in order from not important to important. And this goes through topics like energy supply security, landscape and environmental impact of renewables, gas generations and data centers, energy prices, energy poverty and cost mitigation, degrowth and our global impact, landowner rights, decentralized energy solutions and community energy, and rural development. Now, of course, if there's any other topics that you're interested in and you want to address as most important, please pop them in the chat as well. But if you can fill out a questionnaire, it's really interesting to see the results. I see that most of them are being rated very high on importance, and they're all ranging between 6 and 9 there. Thank you very much for that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you to stick with that link, even if you've already submitted your answers, or click the link again. And I'm going to go to the next question. The next question is, I would like to engage with the transition to renewable energy through, and it gives a few different options: lectures and seminars, regular consultations, small group discussions, videos and reading material, online workshops, community participation events, one-on-one conversations, news updates, and feedback surveys. Now, again, this does not list all the possibilities in terms of engagement with the energy transition. So please feel free to type in the Zoom chat other ways that you'd like to engage, because I'm going to save this chat and save the results of that, and we'll incorporate that into our renewable energy engagement for this year. So thanks very much for filling that out. Really interesting to see the results. The lowest is one-on-one conversation. So I guess people do want to talk in a group or talk on a wider scale about these issues. Okay, now we'll come back to the main call now. Thank you so much for filling that out. Okay. So we're going to get started with our energy poverty webinar now. Energy poverty definitions vary depending on sources and depending on locations, but it relates to households that have to spend a high proportion of their income to keep their home at a reasonable temperature. There are various different considerations to take into account with energy poverty, which include the household's income, of course, their energy consumption, and that relates to their home's energy efficiency, and of course, the costs of the energy itself. Over the last couple of years, we've seen a huge number of job losses, a rising need for energy use at home, and rising energy costs. So this is an issue affecting a huge number of households across Ireland and worldwide. And the current threat, energy security, will also likely have an impact on this. Although energy poverty is widespread, it does not affect everyone equally. Low-income households, people living in the private rental sector, young people, people of colour, and households with health and disability challenges can be particularly affected by energy poverty. So I'm going to share a link in the chat to the Towards a Healthy Renovated Europe report. This is co-authored by Friends of the Earth Europe. I'm just going to pop it in the chat now. You don't have to read it now, but it does have some really interesting information there if you want to look through it at a later stage. But I'll mention some of the key findings here in our Zoom call. This report tells us that over 50 million people cannot sufficiently light, heat, or cool their homes across Europe. It also tells us that inadequate housing costs 194 billion euro per year in public health costs, and it's linked to 100,000 premature deaths annually. In Europe, buildings account for around 40% of all energy consumed and 36% of greenhouse gas emissions. This report also refers to hopeful solutions to these problems. It tells us that for every 1% increase in the energy efficiency targets, 7 million people can be lifted out of energy poverty, which would have both economic and environmental benefits. The report suggests prioritizing funding and financial support for the most vulnerable households, and tells us that building renovation for energy efficiency can have massive benefits to the environment, to health, and to society, while also generating millions of green jobs. So please feel free to take a closer look at that report, which is linked in the chat and also linked with this recording. And now we're going to get started with our speakers. So thank you so much to Issy Petrie, who's going to speak first. Issy Petrie is the Policy and Research Officer with St. Vincent de Paul. Issy works on energy policy and income inadequacy. She previously worked at the Carnegie UK Trust as a Policy and Development Officer, at the New Policy Institute as a Research Analyst, and at the Living Wage Foundation. She has co-authored reports on in-work poverty and regeneration in towns. Issy has a master's in urban studies from University College London, as well as a degree in geography from Durham University. She has an interest in community-led change and regeneration. Thanks so much for joining us, and I'll pass over to you, Issy.
Hi, thank you, and thanks everyone for having me at this conversation today. I'm really looking forward to hearing from speakers and then hearing from everyone in the discussion at the end. I'm just going to take a second and share my slides, if that is okay. I'm sorry, 1 second. Hopefully everybody can see that. So I'm going to speak a bit about SVP and our perspective on energy poverty, speaking a little bit about the impact of the pandemic in particular, and recent rises to the cost of living, and also a few of our sort of key recommendations our key recommendations to address energy poverty and our priorities there. So SVP has over 10,000 volunteer members who work within their communities to support people who request assistance. We received 190,000 requests for assistance last year, and the people we support would be primarily facing low incomes, poverty and exclusion. And our focus would be on a practical approach to supporting people through a system of visitation, where our members would meet with people to offer support, friendship and assistance. So I work in the policy team, and we aim to draw on and represent the experiences of our members who would support people directly in order to advocate for change in policy and practice. So a significant area of the support we provide would relate to energy costs and people experiencing energy poverty. And by energy poverty, we would mean not having access to the energy and the heating that is needed to keep warm and keep healthy at an affordable level for people's incomes. So the diagram on the right would show, I suppose, the multiple causes and how complex the causes can be of energy poverty. And I'm going to come back to these 3 causes later when we think of some of the ways of addressing energy poverty. So we have the cost of energy itself, something we're very aware of at the moment, but it is itself, the cost of energy is itself a complex picture of different people's energy requirements, the fuel source, the energy available, the tariff that is accessible for things like gas and electricity. We also have the energy efficiency of the home and how that relates to and contributes to the overall amount of energy that is needed and how far budgets need to stretch. And we also have the overall importance and the primary importance of incomes and people having an adequate income in the first place to have a decent standard of living, which includes having access to the energy that is needed. So thinking about how many people might be experiencing energy poverty, there are a number of different measurements, but the official, which will kind of shine a different light on or show a different aspect of energy poverty. But the official measurement would look at how many people spend more than 10% of their net income on energy, which comes out at 17.5%, or about 1 in 6 households in Ireland. But I guess an aspect of this definition and something that we see at SVP is many people would kind of cut back drastically on their energy usage and therefore wouldn't reach that level of spending 10% of their net income on energy because that simply isn't affordable. They've got rent costs or food costs or transport costs that limits the amount that they can put towards energy. So they're living in energy poverty because they have to limit the essential energy that they need. And I suppose that figure of around 1 in 6 would be, I guess, the average, a broad brush stroke, but some groups would be more at risk of being in energy poverty than others. So we know that one-parent families would be at high risk, households with a member with an illness or a disability, tenants, people who rent their house, and also people who are unemployed would be at high risk of energy poverty. So in terms of the impact of the pandemic and the rising cost of living, and I guess what's been happening in the last couple of years, in the last quarter of 2021, and so the last few months before Christmas, we saw our calls for assistance related to gas and electricity costs increase by around 20%. And we'd seen kind of over the preceding months, the pandemic and the lockdowns, many people and families were struggling with bigger bills from spending longer at home during lockdown, especially, in cases where maybe children were home from school and the impact that had on, the energy requirements of the house. And this came at the same time, of course, that many people had lost work and were on a lower income for sometimes very extended period of time. So we saw that the pandemic put extra pressure on people experiencing energy poverty and also maybe affected people who weren't previously struggling. So now, kind of over the winter that we're in now, on top of those impacts from the pandemic, which are still very much with us, we're also experiencing the rapidly rising energy costs, which are having a significant impact on inflation and people's cost of living throughout the winter and looking forward now. And that's, of course, falling hardest on those with the least room in their budgets to account for increasing costs, so people on the lowest incomes are facing poverty. And at SVP, we commissioned a survey to see how people are managing these rising costs, the consequences for their energy usage, and also the consequences in other areas of their life and the knock-on impacts that I guess energy costs can have. So we found that the numbers who are finding it difficult to manage financially has doubled since the start of the pandemic, from 9% to 18% who are finding it difficult to get by. So 17%, so almost 1 in 5 people have reported cutting back on essentials, on other essentials, including food, in order to cope with and make allowances for the rising energy costs that people are experiencing. And 40% of people are worried about meeting rising energy costs in the coming 6 months. So what does, I suppose, this mean in reality in terms of the everyday and people's day-to-day? More people will be experiencing energy poverty, and people who are already in energy poverty will be struggling with those costs as those costs mount. And we know that people we support at SVP already limit their energy costs as far as possible by doing things like putting the heating on for only half an hour or sitting without the heat for fear of the next bill that's coming, limiting their energy use, from the lighting and using the cooker to make food, cutting back on essentials in other areas of life and other costs like food or transport to make sure that they can pay the bill or top up the prepayment meter at the end of the week. People might only be using one room of the house, wearing coats indoors. So people are already experiencing these impacts of the cost of energy, and also people who would previously have already been struggling with energy costs are going through this too. So ultimately, what we would be concerned about and need those solutions to be put in place to avoid is more people facing disconnection from suppliers, or people limiting their heating, people on prepayment meters not topping up as they don't have the money, and therefore not having an energy supply at all. And these impacts have severe consequences on people's physical health and on their mental health. And that goes for children living in houses right up to older people experiencing energy poverty. So for example, research from 2019 showed that children in energy poor homes are more likely to have asthma and more likely to have taken multiple courses of antibiotics. But these impacts and the experiences of energy poverty are kind of through those systems and those routes that can be addressed and can be changed. And in terms of solutions, what needs to happen now? If we think about energy poverty as resulting from that combination of inadequate incomes, the actual cost of energy itself, and how much energy is needed to run the house, we can see where some of those solutions might lie, and those steps that can be taken kind of to address the cost of living and the cost of energy now, but also start to pave a path to addressing energy poverty longer term, to make sure that our kind of entire energy system is fairer, and that the safety net we have in place for energy costs, but also the overall cost of living is good enough. It's a strong enough safety net. So fundamentally, we need incomes to be adequate so people can meet their cost of living through the social welfare safety net and through work and wages. No one should be living on a poverty income. So we advocate for social welfare levels to be set against a minimum standard of living that allows everybody to be able to afford what they need. And we advocate for a living wage to be introduced for all workers. Secondly, we would need energy to be affordable to people. Even before recent price increases this winter and at the end of last year, we had amongst the highest electricity costs in Europe. And so for people at risk of energy poverty, a key factor and a key part of the safety net would be making sure the fuel allowance, which is the social welfare allowance targeted towards energy costs, reaching everyone who needs it, and that it is at a level that covers those energy costs. So at the moment, for example, job seekers have to wait a year to be eligible for the fuel allowance, and families on the working family payment aren't eligible to receive that directed support for energy costs. And as part of the government's cost of living measures that were announced a few weeks ago, they added a lump sum directed towards fuel allowance recipients, which is welcome, even if it won't go far enough to fill the gap. It also won't reach all those households who would need support. In terms of retrofitting, and I suppose that medium to longer term path to address energy poverty, we can obviously see how essential it is for houses to be efficient to heat and light in the first place, to create a kind of longer term solution, but also to enable people, I guess, to be part of the gains and the benefits that climate action can bring through kind of more affordable energy costs and warmer homes and the health and well-being benefits that would come from that. So we know some of the carbon tax revenue is being channeled towards free retrofits for eligible households, and local authorities are upgrading part of their local authority stock, which is really important. But the caveat there is, I suppose, the pace of the upgrades and how long it takes to reach everyone, both, I guess, due to the funding that is out there and also kind of constraints within the construction sector and the pace that is possible there. So we know that many people in local authority homes will be waiting a long time for upgrades, and there are lengthy waiting lists also for homeowners who would be eligible for free energy upgrades. But there are also groups who are currently not being reached by those schemes and those pots of fundings that are there. And so front of our minds at SVP would be households who are in energy poverty in the private rented sector, who experience what we call a split incentive, where their landlord would be responsible for improvements. but the tenants is the one experiencing the home, the kind of the warmth or lack of warmth of the home and the energy costs that come from that. And sort of between those two factors, not much progress is made, and the sector itself isn't progressing in terms of energy efficiency as fast as it needs to for people at risk of energy poverty in the sector. So we need to tackle this through kind of policy and funding that supports landlords who have tenants in energy poverty to make those changes that are needed. And it's kind of a vital, really important way of making sure that a bigger gap doesn't keep opening up between homeowners, and particularly homeowners who can afford upgrades, and tenants. And as we progress through the decade and hopefully meet that kind of very big target of 500,000 retrofits by 2030, I'm not going to talk too much more about that because I know we're going to hear more about the private rented sector later. But yeah, I think this is an area where we really need to see that policy put in place that protects tenants and kind of makes plans for the sector. So I'll leave it there, but thanks everyone, and I look forward to hearing from everyone else and having a conversation at the end. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Issy, for sharing that information. Our next speaker is Bulani Mfaiko. Growing up in apartheid ghetto in Cape Town, Bulani became involved at an early age in protests for adequate housing and access to land with Abalali, Bossum Jandolo, healthcare in Kailicha Health Forum as well, and campaigning for improved policing and neighbourhood watches as well. And in 2017, Bulani claimed asylum, seeking protection from violence and targeted killings of LGBT+ people. He's one of the spokespersons at MASI, that's the movement of asylum seekers in Ireland, where he's campaigning for the right to work for all asylum seekers and to end direct provision. Bulani is also on the board of the Irish Council for Civil Liberties with an interest in human rights, migration and politics, while also reading for a PhD in law in TU Dublin. Thank you so much to Bulani for joining us this evening, and I'll pass over to you now.
Good evening, and thank you for inviting me to this talk, Evelyn. I will be very brief. I'll try to be very brief. I'll be mainly speaking about the experiences of asylum seekers whilst in the direct provision system and outside of the direct provision system. Back in the year 2000, I think it will be 22 years this year, since the Irish government rolled out the system of direct provision. The very starting point of introducing direct provision was to take away all the social welfare supports that asylum seekers were entitled to, which were the same social supports that Irish people are entitled to. So asylum seekers before the introduction of direct provision were treated no differently to the way Irish nationals are treated. And so the state decided that they would contract out the provision of accommodation and meals. So it's a bed and 3 meals a day. It would be contracted to private contractors. Private companies all around Ireland would accommodate asylum seekers. Asylum seekers would be deprived of the right to work, and so they wouldn't have access to the labor market. They would not be allowed, not be given support to pursue third level education, for instance. If you want to pursue third level education as an asylum seeker, you were required to pay international tuition fees. Asylum seekers were getting a weekly allowance of €19.10 per week. So it's about 3 meals a day, €19.10 per week. You get a medical card, like all Irish people who are eligible for a medical card, and you would have same access to healthcare. That meant that a lot of asylum seekers would struggle when they get a final decision on their asylum claim. So if they get a positive decision that allows them to live and work in Ireland, that is a refugee status or subsidiary protection or humanitarian leave to remain, it means that they can get out of the direct provision system. They do that mainly through HAP, which is the housing assistance payment that is given to homeless people in Ireland when they need to find accommodation. And that presents difficulty for people coming through the asylum system. It presents difficulty for ordinary Irish people who are reliant on HAP, because a lot of landlords tend to discriminate against people who have HAP because they have a lot of people to choose from when it comes to getting tenants for their properties. And so reliance on the private rental market does affect asylum seekers negatively in terms of finding accommodation, because HUB limits are set at county level. So they vary across different counties, and you might find that in some counties, in general, the amount that you are given is actually not what the market is asking for. It's way below what the market is asking for, and you often have to top it up if you if you haven't the means to do so, so that you can actually get out. And the biggest shock for asylum seekers is when it comes to energy bills, because whilst in direct provision, we don't worry about energy bills or anything like that. The contractor would be looking after that. But when you have had people staying in direct provision for many years, with restrictions on labor market access, then they get out of direct provision, they end up in low paid work. And the first thing that comes in through the post after a month of moving out of direct provision is an energy bill that they are not used to paying, and it's a huge bill. Because when we are in direct provision, I currently live in Noklashin, our building is built with prefabs. So it does really get cold. And often when we are in the room, we have to leave the heating on. If you are in the room, like if you are sleeping in the room, you have to sleep with the heater on, or you'll freeze. You'll be very cold. And so a lot of people, and you might not be used to switching the heater off when they move out of the direct provision system. So the first thing that will come to them is a shock of a bill, a huge bill that they have to pay. And you have to remember that people leaving the direct provision system would be not just responsible for themselves, but they'll also be responsible for people back home, because a lot of us have families at home that are dependent on our incomes. And so people often have to send money back home. And that adds to the high cost of living in Ireland, and contributes to how much is available to them to send back home. To support people. And so you find that people might be working 2 jobs in order to make ends meet if they want to, because they need to be able to provide support for 2 households, the one that's in Ireland and the one that is at home. Cost of living might be lower in some parts of the global south, but in Ireland, it's very high for people who need to cover the expenses. Typical cost, if you are on a minimum wage job, it's very difficult to be able to pay your energy bills. We've had people having to work more than one job, and sometimes people who were working illegally while still in direct provision might still continue to work illegally, cash in hand. So not working legal, they would be allowed to work once they've gotten the status, but they would keep that job that they had that was paying them cash in hand to supplement whatever other income they have. And so it makes it very difficult for people to actually live, because the wages that people are paid aren't really don't cover the cost of living, even when a person does have the housing supports through HUB, which again is very difficult to find a landlord who's willing to rent a property on HUB. The other difficulty, of course, is that people have children, and children have added expenses that they need to cover. When you have a household and you're moving out of the direct provision system. Some people might be wanting to bring their families into Ireland through family reunification. They have to cover those costs. So you have to save money for visas, you have to save money for the plane tickets to bring them in. That adds to the costs once a person has left the system of direct provision, which again makes it very difficult. I often look at people who have left the system of direct provision and been at how they are able to get things done with the little money that they have, because it comes through a lot of sacrifice. It might mean in some cases people have to sleep with their clothes on just to keep warm and keep the heater off, so to save money. on the energy bills. Don't want to get a huge surprise at the end of the month. But I think the Irish state has done a lot of damage in institutionalizing people because when we landed Dublin Airport, many of us would have had jobs, would have had households that we looked after and were able to look after households, but you are stripped of that when you are placed in direct provision, and you are then placed in this particular institution where you don't, you are placed in a position where you don't think about, you have to think about the costs. You don't think about the cost of food. You don't think about the cost of energy. You don't think about the cost of anything because you are told you're going to wake up every day, you're going to go in queue in the canteen for your breakfast, you queue for your lunch, you queue for your dinner, and then you go and collect your weekly allowance that you get. It's minuscule weekly allowance. You're literally going to buy phone credit and maybe a few toiletries, and that's it. It's all spent. And so that is drilled into your mentality whilst you're still in direct provision to be dependent on the state for your living. And it becomes difficult then for people who have been in that system for a very long time. So you can imagine a person who's been in direct provision for 7 to 10 years, it would be very difficult for them to get into the routine of actually living independently in the community on their own. And that's why the movement of asylum seekers has advocated for lifting the restrictions on access to third-level education, lifting the restrictions on the right to work, and ensuring that people are integrated into Irish life from when they land and seek protection, rather than waiting many, many years in the direct provision system for a decision for them to leave. We applaud the government again for welcoming the Ukrainian refugees. They will not be stuck in the system of provision through the EU invoking the Temporary Protection Directive, which will allow them to live and work in the European Union on the same basis as citizens of the Union. And so if the Irish asylum system and every asylum system in the EU was set up like that, so that people aren't kept in limbo, it would actually be much more humane. I think I'll pause then and might engage more in questions.
Thank you very much, Pilani. I imagine that people have a lot of questions. What we might do is continue with the next two speakers and then move on to questions after that. So for anyone who's joined us in the last few minutes, we're going to run through two more speakers and then we'll open up to Q&A when you can unmute and say your questions. But if you have questions and comments as we're going, please feel free to use the chat function below. But for now, we'll move on to our next speaker, which is Claire O'Connor. And Claire is the Energy Policy Officer at Friends of the Earth Ireland. She has a Master's in Climate Change Policy, Media and Society from GCU, where her dissertation focused on science policy interface in Irish climate policy. Claire's recent experience lies in campaigns and policy for NGOs, and prior to this, she provided sustainability consultation and climate programming in the cultural sector. Claire was a member of the Irish Citizens Assembly and former welfare officer of UCD Students' Union. Claire is working to drive an energy transition that prioritises climate and social justice, including work on decarbonisation of heat, energy efficiency measures, and phase out of fossil fuels. Thank you very much for joining us, Claire. I'll pass over to you now.
Thanks very much, Evelyn. I'm just going to share my screen now. I'm going to speak a little bit about retrofitting and energy poverty, and particularly as it pertains to the new national retrofit scheme that was launched in February of this year. So I'll run through the current landscape, a little bit on EU policy and national climate policy, and as well as that Friends of the Earth's thoughts on the new retrofit scheme. Yeah, the current landscape in terms of our reliance on fossil fuels in our home heating sector is not great. We're 70% reliant on fossil fuels in our buildings, with just 1% of the stock being renovated every year up until now. The majority of our homes have an energy rating of C or worse. So that means that 1.5 million homes need to be retrofitted in Ireland. We use 7% more energy than the EU average in our homes, and as well as that, emit 60% more CO2 while we are using that energy. And it hasn't gotten better, I suppose, in recent years. Since 2014, our emissions from the heating sector have increased by 13%. Oh, wait, sorry, I'm just gonna stop this for 1 second because I just realized it's an old version. 1 second there. Sorry, 1 second. So I'll talk you through this very briefly as it continues to load. So yeah, so looking at EU policy, oh right here, it's this. Yeah, last week the so the Central Statistics Office actually gave us an idea of who in Ireland is experiencing poverty, and this isn't specifically energy poverty, but it's really clear from this that people who are in rental accommodation are experiencing significantly increased risk of living in poverty than those who are homeowners. So I think it's really important that when we are looking at these retrofitting schemes and these energy efficiency measures, that we are targeting those people who are most at risk. And this is 2020, so this was actually pre-energy crisis. Yeah, then looking at EU policies. So most recently, 2019 Clean Energy for All Europeans package was introduced, and that was to support the 2015 EU strategy, which included 8 different legislative acts, and many of them had provisions which were relevant to energy poverty. So the Electricity Directive introduced a requirement on member states to define a set of criteria to measure and report on energy poverty. The Energy Performance in Buildings Directive then required states to establish a long-term renovation strategy for their housing stock. And that had to include actions to alleviate energy poverty. As well as that, the Energy Efficiency Directive requires states to focus a share of their energy efficiency measures on specifically on households that are in energy poverty. And then the EU governance regulation requires member states to have regard to energy poverty in their national energy and climate plans. So then looking at Irish policy specifically, so we have some really, really ambitious targets for 2030 as part of our climate targets. So we're going to try and get 500,000 homes retrofitted to BS2 standard by 2030, 400,000 heat pumps installed in homes by 2030, and then 36,500 local authority homes retrofitted by 2030. And then even more recent than that, we have our 2021 Climate Action Plan, which came out in November, and it included a national retrofit plan within it. And they committed to low-cost loans being provided for people who wanted to undertake retrofits as well, which is still yet to be announced. It's going to be announced, I think, in June or July of this year. And they committed to retrofitting 4,500 homes who are at risk of energy poverty this year alone. And then they also committed to reviewing the 2016 to 2019 strategy to combat energy poverty. So at the moment, we don't have any specific policy or strategy on energy poverty in Ireland, unfortunately. And as well as that, then we've committed to ring fencing a lot of our revenue from the carbon tax to fund our national retrofitting programme to combat energy poverty through the Warmer Home Scheme. So the National Retrofit Scheme, it was launched back in February there. There is Micheál and Eamon at their press conference where they shared what exactly was coming up in it. So this is what we have. We have a one-stop shop service for the first time, which is going to be operated by the SEAI, which is basically a service where people can go and they can get all their information on their grants, the labour, and kind of have someone to hold your hand basically as you go through the retrofit process. And they're providing grants of up to 50% to get your home retrofitted to a B2 standard. As well as that, they've looked at more partial grants, so looking at individual energy upgrade grants, so up to 80% for smaller improvements, looking at attic insulation and cavity wall as well. And then free energy upgrades, as I mentioned, through the Warmer Home schemes. And the Warmer Home scheme is specifically for homeowners who are availing of social welfare payments, and they expanded this warmer home scheme this year to also include those on disability allowance who hadn't actually been included before. That's basically what came out in our new retrofitting scheme in February. And we then had 5 different tests of what exactly we want to see and whether or not it would be a success. So does it prioritise vulnerable households and respond to energy poverty risks? Is it accessible? Does it prioritise and support renters? And does it address supply chain issues? And does it line up in getting fossil fuel boilers out of our homes? So yeah, does it prioritise vulnerable households and respond to energy poverty risks? So energy efficient measures, they have to be accessible, inclusive, and they have to deliver benefits for everyone. And the barriers that are preventing low-income households accessing energy efficient work at the moment are large upfront costs and waiting times, and they have to be removed. When we were checking to see, was this new scheme designed in such a way that it would prioritise people who are most at risk of energy poverty? And a positive out of the scheme was that it did prioritise people who are available, who could avail of the warmer home scheme, but that was just for homeowners. And as well as that, they did commit to 4,500 local authority homes to be retrofitted this year. But they did not include any tailored support for renters or for HAP recipients, who are some of the more vulnerable cohorts, as we saw in the graph earlier. And there was no tailored support for the traveller community in Ireland too, which they are probably one of the most vulnerable cohorts, because 77% of the traveller community are actually living in energy poverty at the moment. And this scheme did not include any sort of support, tailored support for them. And then I suppose, is it accessible for all? So positive in terms of accessibility is the one-stop shop where we have someone who will hold your hand through this process. And that's if you can afford a retrofit in the first place, and if you can avail of one of these 50% grants. There is someone who will hold your hand through the process of getting your house to a B2 standard. And in terms of accessibility, the low-cost loans are a really positive addition. They haven't been announced yet. In terms of accessibility for rural Ireland, one issue in rural Ireland is that people like to have labourers and workers come into their home who they know and trust a lot of the time. And I think the SEAI scheme actually hasn't catered for this cohort specifically, and maybe hasn't taken into consideration the specific needs of rural Ireland. Is it accessible for renters? I think that's debatable, because as it stands, there's nothing specifically for renters or even to target landlords specifically to retrofit their homes. And as well as that, for some older homes, for more period homes as well, there is nothing in it for them either. And in terms of accessibility, actually, MABS and UCC did a study recently over the past couple of weeks, and it showed that out of those homeowners that were actually eligible for the warmer home scheme, who are on social welfare payments, that only 9% of those low-income households who this scheme was designed for, they were able to actually access the scheme. So there's huge issues there still in terms of accessibility. And then, does the scheme prioritise and support renters? Issy kind of touched on the issue of split incentive, where there is no real incentives for landlords to retrofit their properties, as they're not the people who are going to see the savings themselves. And the new scheme doesn't have any tailored support for renters, and there's been no engagement with landlords. The one thing is that the Climate Action Plan has committed to implementing minimum BER standards in rental properties, commencing in 2025. So in terms of, does it prioritise and support renters, I would say it doesn't support the 42% of people in Dublin who are living in rented accommodation and have no way of accessing the new retrofit scheme. And then, does it address supply chain issues and skills shortages? So €8 billion has been invested up to 2030 to help with the supply chain scale up. And the new Climate Action Plan has committed to rolling out non-zero or nearly zero energy building and deep retrofitting contractor courses nationwide. But there needs to be a clearer plan, I think, on how exactly they are going to get the labourers and the workers to do this work. And then Yeah, so does the National Retrofit Scheme line up with getting fossil fuel boilers out of our homes? So as it stands, gas boilers can still be installed in homes, which will leave people locked into really expensive gas and fossil fuels for the next 10 to 15 years, which is the average lifespan of a fossil fuel boiler. And unfortunately, that is leaving people in quite a vulnerable and precarious situation with the cost of energy increasing. And the new retrofit scheme didn't address this issue at all, but the government have in their climate action plan mentioned that they will ban the installation of fossil fuel boilers in new homes by 2023. But there needs to be a much clearer plan on how they're going to phase out fossil fuels out of our homes. So what do we need to see next? Gas crisis has kind of shown us the lack of security of fossil fuel heating systems. And another thing we need to do is to ramp up renewables to really promote energy independence. So yeah, we need to commit to ban the installation of gas boilers in homes. We need to update our energy poverty strategy, which has now been expired for nearly 3 years. We need to target support and protections for tenants so that they're not the ones who are left living in energy inefficient homes and left paying really expensive gas bills. We need to specifically address the most vulnerable cohorts, such as the traveller community. And as well as that, we need to phase out fossil fuel subsidies and ramp up renewables so we can address energy poverty, our heating challenges, and the climate crisis all at once. And we have the solutions, and it is a case of we now just need to implement and really, really ramp up implementation.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Claire, and thank you to those putting questions in the chat, and thank you, Bulani, for answering them. I'm now going to pass over to Bryce Goodall. Bryce is a spokesperson for Living Rent, Housing and Climate Change Working Group, and Extinction Rebellion Scotland. He is an organiser and mobiliser with Mossmoran Action Group, Actions Speak Louder Than Words, Climate Camp Scotland, Stop Cambo UK and Scotland, and Direct Action Collective. He's also a member of the Scottish Collective for Activist Materials, Power and Infrastructure, and Scottish Community Legal Activist Project. He worked with COP26 Coalition and Stop Climate Chaos Scotland as lead accessibility officer. He was also a core organiser with MedAct, as well as being involved in a huge number of other grassroots initiatives. So thank you so much for joining us, Bryce. I'll pass over to you now.
Thank you so much, and wow, thank you very much for the introduction. I really appreciate that. I'm just going to put my introduction and my bio introduction into the chat for people to have a look at later on. But I just want to say thank you very much, and thank you very much to Friends of Ireland for inviting Living Rent to discuss about what really is hopefully going to be a turning point, and hopefully we can be able to address a lot of these issues which have been talked about, because we definitely need a just transition for tenants, because housing and the built environment represent one of the biggest opportunities that we have to organise to combat climate change. We need to be working on these. Will have a knock-on beneficial impacts, effects and impacts, whether that be on tenants' energy bills, as we've just seen by our amazing speakers about the cost of living crisis, which is going to be expected hitting tenants across Scotland and UK of up to 50%, which is crazy. We've also got to ensure that we've got to prioritise tenants' health, because the thing is this, so housing is healthcare, and also new jobs. Currently, 40% of what we spend on health is due to our buildings. And to hit the net zero by 2050, the UK construction industry has to double in size, which would create around about 500,000 jobs. We do not need to live in a fuel. We don't need to live in fuel poverty or wait for a revolution in heat technology. The technology to make our homes green already exists. It takes just political will to do so. And our homes need to be refurbished now. We need a just transition for our homes, which improves tenants' health, economic situation, well-being, whilst ensuring tenants are not left to foot the bill. So I want to just take you through what we are doing in Living Rent and what we would like to talk about is a new deal for tenants. But I want to primarily focus the new deal on tenants on energy poverty and about how we can be able to talk about this in a kind of particular context. So one of the things and one of the main things that we want to talk about is rent controls, because we need a points-based rent controls that tie in maximum rent to the quality, standard and energy efficiency of the property, which will ensure tenants do not bear the burden of environmental refurbishments, whilst ensuring financial incentives for landlords to make green improvements to their properties. We must, and we also need, and in part of that, when these energy efficiencies are like the retrofits which were being mentioned, it's crucial that retrofitting does not result in renovictions, which we have seen happening in Scotland, either because the tenants are priced out of their homes because they are evicted to enable refurbishment. Landlords shouldn't be able to force out tenants using green refurbishments as an excuse or through punitive rent increases to make up for the costs of refurbishment. Any plans to make the rented housing more energy efficient need to be tied to a points based of rent controls and greater protection for tenants. So I just want to maybe take just a tiny side step to talk about energy efficiency and improving that housing quality piece, because as over 50% of the housing stock fails average energy efficiency standards, most of it's in EPC-D or below, to be quite honest, or below our properties in Scotland. Tenants throughout Scotland are left to face cold and damp homes and ever-increasing bills. Domestic heating represents 16% of Scotland's carbon emissions. Tenants need a bold plan for refurbishments to improve the energy efficiency of their housing, cut fuel bills and ensure to reducing Scotland's carbon footprint, and they need it now. Current deadlines must be pushed forwards, like the 2025 target, which is being proposed. We need things done now. We don't need things done in the future. We need it done now. So we need to scale up that investment in refurbishment. We need to enable better jobs, more affordable fuel bills, and addressing the need for serious climate action. Now, within all that, we need political will. We need the regulations. So today, it's okay to build or rent our homes that trap people into fuel poverty, and that's not fit for the future whatsoever. Building regulations must guarantee healthy, safe homes and be subject to independent certification and verification of performance. The repairing standards need to provide clear descriptions of what it is and what's not acceptable, and needs updating, including taking consideration EPC ratings, heating systems, and outright failure of repairing standards. The penalty systems for council, social and private landlords must be reviewed based on formal independent investigations. And when we're talking about building new homes, we need to build regulations which are fit for the future, because new builds must be built in line with the IPCC recommendations of near zero energy, using a fabric first approach that ensures insulation, better materials, better windows in place over high-tech solutions. Heat pumps are no use if windows can't close. They must be designed for deconstruction to accelerate Scotland's transition to a circular economy and they must be accessible, like what our previous speakers have already outlined so eloquently. And also we need to be genuinely affordable, and we need to be built on safe terrain, with materials that do minimum environmental harm. It's about the holistic approach of trying to reduce the energy poverty. But we need to ensure that we've got to ensure democracy at the heart of what we are doing. Because secondly, to ensure that our members in living rents, our interests are at the heart of any discussions about a greener, safer housing system. And we will not accept the cost of any required upgrades or retrofittings falling on the tenants, or that tenants be evicted following rising rents. And we will fight to ensure that the individual households and communities are consulted, properly consulted, and approve of any changes to their homes or lived environments. And what is so critical at this critical juncture, what we're talking about today, is we need no disconnections. We need the UK government to promise that housing is a human right, and so is livable housing. We're demanding to end the disconnection of energy, power and water and utilities to all housing if people fall into arrears, because housing is a human right. Now, taking all this anger and what we have actually taken, the anger of what we have experienced and all the lived experience from all of our members, what have we done about this? What we've done is we've successfully lobbied the Scottish Government, which thankfully is now going on to a much better trajectory now by actually going into cooperation with the Scottish Green Party, which actually is shown to be amazing for what we've amazingly have worked together into developing a cooperation deal with the Scottish National Party. And I'm not going to politicise this too much, but I want to just define it straight onto what we've successfully in our lobbying and the power which we have in our union have secured. We have secured actually an agreement for a new deal for tenants, and that is going to be an amazing. And what we're hopefully going to do is hopefully going to introduce a housing bill at the second year of the parliamentary session to deliver a number of legislative changes required to implement the housing strategy for a new deal for tenants. Because hopefully in Scotland, we're going to be creating a new housing regulator for a private rented sector to improve standards and enforce tenants' rights. We're going to enhance tenants' rights by including through greater restrictions on evictions over winter. And that means that basically winter evictions will be absolutely gone, because we need to protect the most vulnerable in society. And we also want to provide additional security for tenants. And we also want to introduce a new rights for tenants. What we want to ensure, for example, giving tenants greater flexibility to decorate their home and to keep, for example, pets. Because as I say, it's about trying to ensure the house makes house feel to yourself. But we want to put in also putting additional penalties and compensation for illegal evictions, such as for rent evictions. So this is what we are delivering. We are delivering this because we can deliver this because we have the power, because we have mobilised amazingly in regards to this. We've just launched today our new deal for tenants because we believe it's rents down and rights up approach. So what we're needing right now is, again, affordable homes. We need quality homes. We need secure homes. We need homes that are ours. We need a stronger voice for tenants. And we would, and I always want to put my hand of friendship over to my Irish friends in such, for example, like Catu and friends there, friends of the Republic of Ireland, because honestly, we want to work with you, because we want to work in solidarity and support, because we can deliver this. if we can deliver it in Scotland, we can well, I'll tell you some, by the way, I'm sure it can be delivered in Ireland. So in closing, everyone, I just want to say thank you very much for offering me this opportunity to speak today. I'm going to drop into the chat right now an amazing Insta bio, which I've created this afternoon, which will hopefully give you links to joining Living Rent, because we want people to join Living Rent as a member. And if you would like, and if you're hearing this from Scotland, if you're listening to this from Scotland, please do join Living Rent, because Living Rent is actually doing an amazing resource within this. And we also want to ensure that we want to ensure you amplify that statement for climate change, which we have put out on our website. We want you to amplify that loud and clear. We want you to also endorse our new deal for tenants, because this is why we need to show force. We need a political will. And the only way to gain political will is that actually, if you work together with us by endorsing our campaign and amplifying it on your social media channels. And I want you to also look at our achievements, because there's so many achievements within our member defence teams across Scotland. Our member defence teams are part of our service part of our union, which delivers radical change by actually claiming, which we've been able to secure thousands of pounds of compensation for our tenants. We've been able to secure delays to eviction orders. We've actually secured so much wins because we are working intersectionally. We're working amazingly well, and we are putting the power back into the hands of tenants, and we are rising above the fire pit of the well-invested and probably well-funded landlords, which are profiting off the backs of vulnerable tenants. So I just want to say thank you so much once again for listening to me. And I just want to say that it's time that we ping rents down and rights up. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Bryce. That was fantastic. And it's great that you mentioned turning anger into action and lobbying, because a lot of the subject matter touched on tonight is really quite horrifying. So what I might do is I'll copy and paste some links in the chat for those looking to join the many organisations speaking this evening, including the Living Rent joining page and the newsletter, and also for people who want to join CATU locally here, our tenants union in Ireland. There's a link for that there in the chat. And I might move over to questions now, because I know people have been expressing their horror and shock in the chat. Bilani, one of the questions that you answered there in the chat was about barriers faced by asylum seekers when it comes to third level education. So I was wondering if you might be able to shed some more light on those barriers.
Well, the biggest barrier, of course, would be tuition fees, because in theory, the government will tell you that you are free to study, but or if you earn 38.80 per week from the state, realistically going to any third level institution to study and funding it yourself is going to be very difficult. There were certain, there was an advisory group that was established by the government to review the system of direct provision, but also the supports that are provided to asylum seekers. The group recommended a number of things. That one, the weekly allowance be increased. It was never increased. The group recommended that asylum seeking children be given the child benefit, because we had raised concerns around children experiencing poverty while in direct provision. They go to the same schools as Irish children. They go through the same things in school. They need the same supports when it comes to extracurricular activities, but their household income, of course, doesn't allow for their parents to be able to provide them all the supports that they need. And so there was a call to give asylum-seeking children the child benefit by January 2021. The government refused to do that. And so there are quite a lot of opportunities, missed opportunities to improve the quality of life for asylum seekers, and the government always chooses which recommendations to implement when reports are published, and that's the sad reality. But they did introduce a scholarship. So an asylum seeker who has been in the country for at least 3 years can apply for a scholarship to study at that level education. If they get the scholarship, then they'll get study supports on similar basis to the ones you get via SUSI. It's not exactly called SUSI, but it's there for asylum seekers who have been in the country for at least 3 years.
Thank you. And I'll highlight some ways that people can ask questions, because there's a few different options. You can put typed questions into the chat. You can also just have your camera on and physically raise your hand, or you can use the reactions button on the bottom of the screen to use the raised hand reaction. And that way I can let you unmute for a moment to ask any questions. So feel free to type them away. See, I might ask you a question about your presentation had a slide of the SPP recommendations, and I wonder, what can an individual do to support those recommendations coming about?
Yeah, so we had a few of our recommendations. I mean, those were just some of our, I guess, top priorities, but we would have sort of wider recommendations as well as I guess working with like energy suppliers and regulators. So those were just a few. But I suppose really we need to see, I guess, the political will and the recognition of the importance of everyone needing an adequate income, and how important that is, that the strength of that safety net is there for all of us. And it's a good thing for all of us to have a strong safety net. And that goes for overall income, so whether that's social welfare income, whether that's living wage, as well as the safety net that is targeted towards energy costs, you know, and how important that is right now. So I suppose building that recognition of how important that is for everybody, and that political recognition is a really important thing. And I think that cuts across all of the, I guess, particular policy issues that we might speak to, whether that's energy, whether that's housing. It's really important that people have that sufficient income. So I guess that would be a really top priority for us at the minute. But I think, raising awareness, making, I guess, the message felt, you know, amongst us as a, I guess, a community and a society, and also politically, that there is support there, that no one in Ireland should be living on a poverty income. It's not good. It's not good for anyone. It's not good for us. And the resources are there to sort of bring that to an end, whether that's social welfare, the living wage, targeted supports. And you know, it's time for that decision to be made and progress to be made there.
Thank you. And there's a question from Kate there.
Hi guys. Thank you for all the presentations. They were amazing and really insightful and very varied panel. So thank you for all of your insights. I guess I'm curious as to where the government is at with all these proposed policy positions, because they sound just like, you know, so like a basic human right for so many of these issues. And especially then for Claire, with the kind of movement away from fossil fuels and the subsidies towards renewable energy, do you think there is kind of more of an opening now with the awareness of dependency in the east of fossil fuels, and maybe is that a push towards renewable energies policy? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a really good question, Kate, particularly on the awareness. And I think a new poll came out, I don't know, was it this morning or over the weekend, that showed that I think it was like 63% of Irish people now support moving towards renewables as a response to the current gas crisis and as a way to move off fossil fuels. So I think you're right. I think like there is now a real sense of urgency amongst everyone and a lot more awareness that we really do need to get off them. But maybe we're lacking in the awareness of like it's, it's easy to think of like the broad policy picture that like, oh yes, someone else should get us off renewables. But then when it actually comes down to us getting off fossil fuels on our homes, I think there is a lack of awareness in that area specifically. And I think the government can be doing a lot more to make people aware of how day to day that they do rely on fossil fuels and the impacts of that, and how we can really, yeah, the government do need to prioritize, I think, that awareness campaign for getting people off fossil fuels in their homes as soon as possible. And I think, as unfortunate as the gas price crisis is, it absolutely has to be used as, it has to be leveraged now as an opportunity to ramp up deployment of renewables and to make our homes warmer and healthier and more energy efficient. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Claire. And then just Issy, with the introduction of the living wage, where is the government with that?
So in the programme for government a couple of years ago, there was a commitment to introduce the living wage in the lifetime of this government, which, you know, we haven't seen those steps made yet. The Low Pay Commission is actually open as a consultation at the minute until a couple more weeks. So we will be making a submission to that, and we would very much, I guess, like to see those real movements. You know, we've seen that commitment within the programme for government. We now need to see the minimum wage actually going up to make that realistic and make that happen within the lifetime of its government, because, you know, the years go quickly, don't they? And especially the last couple of years, like, things happen, and just the movement needs to be made in the rates now. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Bryce to come in there as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I think to get the political will and the government to listen from a Scottish perspective on how we have been able to secure key commitments from the Scottish government on these matters, is if we can look back into history of how we have organised and mobilised around this. I think that the biggest thing which I would urge anyone on this call is to work with tenants unions, work with CATU, and encourage people to join CATU as a union member, because once you've got that community in the local branches which start to grow and start to really have that power. For example, in Living Rent, it takes 100 paid dues members represents a branch, and basically when we've got those branches all interconnected and working holistically and working intersectionally as well, it's important to mention that once you've built that network and you're going out and you're doing all that amazing outreach and you're speaking the common language of everyday people in the communities and the neighbourhoods in which you live in, and you're getting to know your neighbours, you're getting to know like all these issues. Once you've done that, that collective voice is so strong, it's very overpowering, and it can be quite overpowering to politicians to ignore and to be blindsided by it. And I think that's so important to actually mention that, because we have been able to, for example, for example, we went to the Scottish Parliament, and we basically at the lawn of the Scottish Parliament, we put in stakes of all the eviction notices which were launched during the pandemic. We were basically put them all on stakes, and we basically showed them up. We just showed the Scottish government up, and we have been doing protests outside the lettings agents, outside the landlords' houses, outside of all these basic powerhouses. And by doing that and not willing to be ignored and be ignored, that has now acted, that power, organising to power, has worked so really well, and we've now actually been able to successfully going to high-level meetings with government ministers, to our MSPs, our MPs, and actually have that legitimacy of going into those meetings and actually speaking truth to power. And by doing that, we've been able to actually secure that New Deal for Tenants, and we're working now on our New Deal for Tenants packet campaign in Living Rent. We're working to actually bolster that, because we know for sure, and I think you'll all know it, and I think this is another thing, is the biggest threat to what's been discussed is the lobbying power that the landlord, professional landlords associations across, not I would say in Scotland for sure, and but also for in the Ireland, and also the big oil and gas lobbying organisations inside the big oil and gas companies. I mean, we've seen that, for example, through like the Stop Cambo campaign, another campaign which I'm involved with in the COP26 coalition. What we need really is not climate change, we need system change. And the only way to deliver it is through powerful organisations and actually allying yourself and working with those groups. So I think definitely first step is go out to CATU, work with CATU, because they are part of Acorn International, which we have affiliated to as well. And we build that international solidarity, can be so overpowering. We get the goods, and we're getting the goods in Scotland.
Thank you. Can I ask if anyone else has any questions? If you want to raise your hand on camera or use the reaction button, or just unmute yourself.
I think there's a question in the chat, Evelyn, just on the potential wealth redistributive effects of the retrofitting scheme. I can read it. So Michael asked, has analysis been carried out on the potential wealth distributive effects of the retrofitting scheme? It seems like those who would benefit would skew wealthy. I think it's a really good question, and that analysis I don't think has been carried out at the moment, and I definitely think there is a need for that analysis to be carried out, because even with the new grants of 50% for a full retrofit, I think the average retrofit costs around between 50 and 60,000 euros. So even with a grant of 50%, you still need to have 25,000 euro up front to pay for that. So I think there's a very real risk that it will end up just benefiting people who could afford it already. And I think what they have tried to do with the carbon tax is to ring fence it to the warmer home scheme to help those people who are at risk of energy poverty. But I think the definition of energy poverty in this case is very narrow and doesn't include anyone who's renting. Sorry, my daughter's the definition of people who are living in energy poverty, it doesn't apply to people who are in energy poverty. And I think you're right, a lot more analysis needs to be done on this issue, and they need to be included as well. Sorry.
Thank you so much, Claire. And I might go back to another question in the chat, which Delaney addressed, which was asking how do we end direct provision? You were mentioning some upcoming public meetings with MASI and letters to TDs. Could you tell us more about that, Delaney?
Some might remember that in 2020, when the negotiation for the formation of government were happening, we actually circulated a letter. It was very simple and easy, with a simple, easy ask. We asked for the government to end the system of direct provision. We asked for short-term measures that would get people out of direct provision, like introducing a regularization scheme. We got the commitment to end direct provision. We got the 2 regularization schemes for both undocumented people and for people who have been in the asylum process for at least 2 years. They'll be given permission to live and work in Ireland until, well, it's basically a pathway to Irish citizenship. And so they are quite effective. I think more than 20,000 people sent those emails. to their TDs and the ministers that we had targeted for those specific emails. And so we will be sharing those on our website and on our social media feeds once we have them set up. We are currently working on organizing a public meeting. It usually would be in Dublin because it's most central for many people, because all of us will be traveling from around the country, from direct provision centers around the country to whatever venue we get for that public meeting. But the idea is to put pressure on the government because there's quite a lot happening now that may impact on their commitment to end the system of direct provision. They've put a date of December 2024. That's when they hope to close the direct provision centers as we know them and roll out a new asylum reception system that's hopefully human rights compliant. But when we look at things that are happening today, it becomes very difficult to imagine that will happen because they are currently increasing their reliance on hotels. They've just procured more hotels for asylum seekers. There are more people coming in. Ukraine means that there will be more people coming in again who will need assistance with accommodation, and they're talking about procuring more hotels and possibly using military camps and building more refugee camps in using those military campsites as refugee camps, as they did in the 50s when Hungarians came to Ireland. So we hope that we don't get to that worst case scenario, but there is quite a lot of room for consent. There are quite a lot of things that make us concerned at the moment because it's taking longer now for people to even apply for asylum. Today, I was in the International Protection Office with somebody who arrived in Ireland in November, and they haven't been given an opportunity to formally apply for an asylum. So they aren't recognized as an asylum seeker. They aren't getting any of the benefits associated, pathetic benefits that are associated with being an asylum seeker, like the weekly allowance of 38.80. They're not getting it. So you can imagine a situation where you have a child and you are in that situation where you aren't getting money, you are not allowed to work, and your child needs things like we all need to live. And you only get a bed and 3 meals a day in the hotel, and that's it. There's nothing else they can give you, and that becomes very unbearable for a lot of people in the asylum process. So it is concerning to us that we are seeing quite a lot of that now, reliance on hotel and increased reliance on hotels with delays in processing times, and yet we have this commitment to end direct provision, which doesn't seem very realistic.
Thank you, Bionani. I'll share the link again in the chat for the stad.ie for those to join the campaign to end direct provision. But also people can follow Mazzy on Twitter and Facebook and learn about upcoming actions. I believe there's a book launch for the Ending Direct Provision book tomorrow as well, streamed live on the Facebook. So look forward.
I forgot to mention that. I'm speaking at that tomorrow. I forgot about it.
Well, we'll see you there. Can I ask if anyone has any other questions? Okay, I might put a question to Bryce, because Bryce, you mentioned the issue of evictions with the landlord giving the reasoning of green refurbishment. Are you seeing a lot of that in Scotland?
Thank you very much for that question. What we're seeing is I wouldn't be able to answer that question right now because I will admit, and I'm an honest person, I'm not done my research regards to that today. But what I can say for certain is that there has been plenty of evictions that have been happening across Scotland during the after the pandemic, and actually was trying to get evictions pushed through even during the pandemic, during the winter time. And that just goes to show you how callous the landlords are. But one of the things which we want to ensure is that anybody who, and one of the biggest things, the biggest challenges as well when it comes to the renovations and the evictions, the threat of eviction, is that in Scotland are schemes to try and actually improve the quality of housing, such as like cavity wall insulation, double glazing, and various other like schemes which were set up, solar panels, for example. All of them you have to seek the consent of your landlord, and it has to be the landlord has to be responsible for taking that on board and doing that, because it's technically their home. However, it's not really their home if they're not living in that property 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, which the tenant is. And we believe it's actually should be the tenant's decision to actually do those upgrades, and they should receive a protection from being evicted for trying to improve their home. And I understand that the landlord may own that property, but the thing is that we believe strongly that actually that pales in the comparison for when actually a tenant is facing fuel poverty and going to have a knock-on effect with arrears, and that arrears when built up can actually result in that tenant being evicted. So I think it's quite a holistic issue when it comes to when you want to improve your home, because right now I can't. I've got to seek the permission from my landlord, and I've got to then find that finance to do that. And then once I take that on board, that improvement for that, I have to take responsibility for the repair and upkeep of that. It's crazy. So yeah, I think it's important that we try and that we ensure that there's guarantees and protections inside from being evicted due to actually just trying to live in a humane and warm and safe home, because I think everyone would agree that that's a basic human right. And yeah, it's something which we believe at Live and Rent, but we hold dear to ourselves, that we believe that is a human right, and it's something that we need to protect at all costs.
Thank you very much, Bryce. Now there's more information being shared in the chat there, and I will encourage all our attendees tonight to share different organisations that they suggest getting involved in and the different information they have. But I'm going to actually put a question to our attendees again, because there's another thing I wanted to know, just to get some information about topics that you'd like to address, because we will be having further engagement sessions and another workshop on this later on. So I'm just going to grab a link here to another question like the one we had earlier at the start of the call. I know not everyone was on the start of the call, but if you click on this link, it should take you to a question in a slide which asks, are there any other energy topics and affected groups or organisations that you would like to get involved with? So you can type a short answer there just to put in suggestions that you have, because we'd love to know what kind of topics you're interested in, whether it's something you'd like to learn more about or something you've already learned about that you think is a really pressing issue that we need to look into, and other organisations and affected groups that you'd like to hear more work from and have their voices highlighted as well. So food systems and food security, thank you very much for popping that in. Okay, while people are typing there, I'll ask if anyone wants to raise a hand or unmute for a moment to ask a question to any of our speakers. Everyone's very quiet this evening. I might put another question out. I might put a question to Claire. I know, Claire, that you're having a busy time there in the background, but I was going to ask you that you mentioned the ban of gas installations, and I was wondering Have you looked into the kind of effects that's going to have on individuals, whether it's people who are planning ahead to have them installed in the next couple of years, or people who've just had them installed now?
I know it's a weird one because my gas boiler is actually on its last legs here as well at the moment, and I'm in that predicament right now of, do I get a new gas boiler or do I get a heat pump? And I don't think heat pump is within my price range at the moment, so it probably is a case of getting another gas boiler. And yeah, it's like a very lived reality for a lot of people that they are just going to be stuck on gas for many years to come, unfortunately. And a lot of us just don't have the means to like make that investment into heat pumps at this very moment. So and I think the government they haven't really addressed that fully in the new retrofit scheme or in their climate action plan at all. And they really need to start, I suppose, putting in a strategy of how exactly they are going to get people off gas. And I think they need to increase the grants for heat pumps and really start to roll that out, yeah, in a much more equitable way.
Yeah, and Bryce, can you come in on that as well, please?
Yeah, because I think the other thing which is quite interesting, and this is just me taking my living rent hat off for 1 second, because this is just something I'm just incredibly interested in as a climate justice activist as well, is that I did some research upon about gas engineers, also the domestic gas engineer market, and also about the trades. So gas engineers, central heating engineers, and plumbers, and all that, and all of those trades brought together. And interestingly, what I've actually found out through speaking to and researching about, speaking to people and researching about this, is that some gas engineers who have went on apprenticeships in the UK, some of them have been left without any understanding of, or have inadequate education of how to adequately calculate heat loss within a property. So what that has resulted in, due to the education of gas engineers not being high, how would say, at top level, is that's resulted in actually gas engineers installing oversized boilers and selling boilers which are oversized for a property. And what that results in is the consumer having to basically use more gas, more heat to try and heat the property. They have also, it also means that the water inside, for example, radiators, they can corrode more. They can build to have more sludge. And that's linked in with the work we're seeing, for example, with housing associations and also private landlords, is they rarely want to clean and properly service a boiler. They just go in and just do a landlord safety check. It doesn't really service a boiler too. And by doing that, then the tenant, me, I have to put my heating up much more because the sludge in my radiators are so much so that I'm having to fight against that. So it's the ripple effect starts to happen it starts at the education source of actually ensuring the workers are actually adequately trained and adequately know about the new generation of technologies, and actually can actually be competent in actually servicing it and maintaining that. And what we've seen within living rent, and put my living rent hat back on now, is that living rent has seen time and time again that even when we put these renovations in place, the renovations, how is landlords and landlords meant to maintain the new systems? when they're getting renovated. And I'll give you one example, my own example. I live in a passive house, which is actually called, it's basically means is I've got no vents on my windows. It's delivered by vents in my house through a mechanical heat, ventilation and air recovery system. It's one of the flagship homes by Fife Council, where I live in Fife. And one of the things they introduced a new system. They put a brand new system called a new Greenwood air vac, but they subcontracted that maintenance out to a contractor who had no idea of actually how to maintain it to manufacturers' instructions. What did that lead to? That led to my heat recovery and air ventilation recovery system, which was meant to reduce my energy bills, make me have a healthy air in my whole property, and make my life generally better in my house. That resulted in actually that system breaking down and being condemned by the council and by the subcontractor, and that now had to result in another one between £2,000 to £3,000 of money being spent on a new system installed in my property because it was poorly maintained. And now I've got a better, more higher efficient system, and now I'm living better now. But that lesson is so vital. Is that when people in Ireland are going to be thinking, right, let's get rid of renovations, let's get all these amazing technologies to improve people's homes. Just think about how are they tendering for the maintenance contracts? Because once it's all been there and they get all the lovely glamour piece in the press and all that, oh, it's really, 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 really good. They don't actually, when you see that, it doesn't happen in reality. It causes a lot of issues, and it causes our rents. It causes us to be worried about that impact. So I just wanted to say that just be careful when you're advocating for renovations. Make sure it's actually getting competent workforce to actually deliver those systems. Hope that makes sense, and thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Bryce. Now, Kate has a question, and then we'll speak to Deirdre after that.
Thanks, Bryce. I think that's a really good point that you highlighted again. I think Issy touched on it as well, as the kind of crossover of health in this issue. And it is something I was thinking about, just to kind of redirect the question back to Issy, is that have you found that speaking to the government, or that cross-sector kind of issue, does that kind of emphasize the importance of this? Do you think that like it resonates more, you know, kind of when you, like with the SDGs, it's like when you have an issue that crosses over everything or a few different sectors, I feel like it resonates with people because it highlights the impact of it. And then just also to Buleni, it's horrible to hear that there's more hotels being bought, especially after the white paper was produced in 2021, kind of outlining the government's change of tact for accommodation for direct provision. So obviously that's kind of fallen to the side. Yeah, just your opinion on that as well.
Yeah, so on your first point there, Kate, on the kind of crossover nature of energy poverty and how it touches on all of these different issues, both within, I suppose, individuals' lives. So there's your income, there's your, your energy costs, there's how that impacts on your health and on your experience of home and your well-being at home. So within an individual, it has that crossover of issues. And then I suppose at a societal level, it is also one of these areas where, on the one hand, I suppose it's caused by multiple different things. But then when we start to think about solutions, I guess the other side of that is that it can tackle things, a lot of different things at the same time. So you can start to bring down, people's expenditure, see those real health improvements, physical health, mental health improvements, and also obviously, the climate transition that needs to happen for all of us. These can all happen simultaneously. And then the other one is, bringing about jobs for people, and ideally really good jobs for people that offer career prospects and adequate training, as we've heard is so important, and also jobs kind of throughout the country, and hopefully over, well, it would have to be over a very sustained period. So there are these kind of multiple things coming together, and I think that's the importance, and Claire mentioned, of having an energy poverty strategy that is kind of owned by different, it's kind of cross-departmental, because there are multiple causes that need to be tackled at the same time, and there are multiple benefits that need to be seen. So it very much does need to be a whole government approach around, there is this opportunity of tackling more than two things, or more than two things at once, but only if it's taken and very much owned by different departments as a joint challenge. So yeah, I mean, that's definitely what we would like to see. And I mean, you could see it across lots of different issues. Housing would be another one, of course, that's related, but I think this is an issue where it very much comes together at the nexus of different things, and that joint strategy is really necessary. Thank you.
And Bilali, I might ask you to speak about the issue of more hotels being bought and white paper and what that means at this stage.
Yeah, I think we always knew that it was going to happen. Like when the Catherine Day Advisory Group published a report with recommendations, one of the things we were aware of was that there would be people coming in annually every year. In fact, all the recommendations were targeted towards expecting around 3,500 new applications for asylum each and every single year. And now we are told that the government received 2,900 asylum claims in 3 months. That means that there'll be more people coming to seek asylum. And the government wasted 2021 because they did not, the Catherine Day report was published in 2020. They did not implement many of the recommendations until very recently. They waited for a court order, for instance, driving licenses. On the right to work, they didn't implement the recommendation in full. So they reduced the number of months that an asylum seeker has to wait for a work permit, which is, it used to be 9 months, it's now reduced to 6 months. But still, there are people in direct provision who aren't allowed to work at all. And those people will remain in direct provision for the foreseeable future. And so with people being stuck in direct provision, thousands of people being stuck in direct provision, and 2,900 new people in 3 months, which is very high, because if that continues, you are looking at levels that we haven't seen since 2002, when 11,000 people came and applied for asylum in 1 year, which is very high for Ireland, because usually it would be something around 3,000 to 3,500 people annually applying for asylum. It's high for Ireland, but not high in terms of, in comparison to other EU states. You get countries in the EU of similar size to Ireland in both economic size, but also population size, who receive much, much more than that. So it's not insurmountable for the Irish state, but the Irish state has never really had a properly planned asylum system. So when you talk about the Department of Justice, for instance, which oversees the administration of the asylum system, you're talking about waiting times for people to apply for asylum. You're talking about waiting times for people to be invited for interviews. You're talking about waiting times for a decision once a person has been interviewed. Now, there are people who are waiting for interviews. My roommate has been waiting for an interview for the past 3 years. You're talking about people waiting for decisions, and once a decision comes, you're talking about waiting for family reunification applications, waiting for citizenship, everything to do with migration Every application that you have to submit, you will have to wait a long time to get a positive decision. And that contributes then to people being bogged down into being stuck in the system, whilst there are still people coming in. Now they've rolled out they've introduced the scheme that will regularize asylum seekers, which means that they will have the same entitlement to housing and social welfare supports as Irish citizens. We expect about 5,000 or so people will have status to stay in the country. Those are people in direct provision today, and they will need a way to get out of direct provision. You think about the housing market in Ireland, like rent being high, and discrimination when it comes to HAP, but also being persons from migrant background will also experience discrimination. Those are things that the state needs to adequately plan for and to provide supports. I think as DePaul and Peter McBurry Trust and JRS are contracted by the Irish government to provide support for people to move out of direct provision, they will need more support from the state. I think they might even need more hands on board in order to get people out of the system, because we are going to have more people coming in, because there's conflict in Yemen, there is conflict in Afghanistan, it's conflict in Ethiopia, in the Tigray region, in Eritrea, in Somalia, and we are seeing people coming from those regions, and now there is Ukraine. And so it is sadly a reality that people will be coming into the state, but the state doesn't seem to be ready to host.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all the speakers and all those commenting in the chat. I think Laurie put it very well, that we really appreciate the enthusiasm and the energy, which I presume pun intended there, so thank you so much. And I'm going to bring in for a moment, because part of this is tying in all the different organizations working to challenge these issues that we're covering in the Learning Hub series. So I'll put some links in the chat about how you can join and follow all the organizations speaking here this evening. And Deirdre is here this evening, who is the ambassador for Earth Hour here, which is another chance to raise awareness for these issues and to take action for these causes. So I'll ask Deirdre to speak for just a moment before we wrap up.
Super. It's actually a suggestion for Issy. So in Ireland, before Mooney in RTE, he suggested everybody switch off their electricity use while he was on the radio, and he did it in conjunction with EirGrid. So the monies that we could save in Ireland, if everybody who wasn't in fuel poverty joined those who are in fuel poverty and chose over the weekend of Earth Hour to switch off for at least an hour. So St. Vincent de Paul is linked to an electricity provider. Perhaps they can have that conversation to invite everybody to save energy that weekend, and the money saved goes directly to those in fuel poverty. So for the rest of us who enjoy Earth Hour, for example, it's the only global window in the world where people come together to take action on climate. And for some, it's just that 1 hour simply switching off the lights. But for other people, it's what actions can we take within our companies? How can we add our voices? How can we switch our vegan menus for the weekend? And how can we raise our voices for action on climate? So I'm just putting some stuff in the chat box link for you here. So it's this coming 26th of March. But Issy, to have that conversation to see, if we all switch and decide to save energy, can the energy saving certificates and energy saved actually be directly given to those in fuel poverty? And those of us not in fuel poverty to be in solidarity with those who have to choose food or fuel.
Thanks, Deirdre. Sorry, my internet just wavered there, but thank you. I hadn't heard that suggestion before, so thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deirdre. So I've put some links in the chat there for anyone who wants to get involved with SVP or support and follow Mazzy, or follow them on Facebook, or join Living Rent's mailing list to keep up to date on Living Rent's work. Thank you very much, Brian, for those 2 thumbs up there. But also a local tenants union, CATU. I've put in CATU's website there, catuireland.org, for those to join it and follow it, and as well as One Future groups as well, if you're looking for a local local group to join up to tackle fossil fuels and energy poverty, please take a look at that. Our next Learning Hub session is going to delve further into this in an interactive workshop and conversation. So that's going to be 2 weeks from today on the evening of Monday, the 21st of March. So you get an email to remind you about that. So we hope you can join us to tell us more about your personal experiences for all here today. And of course, we want to improve these sessions as well to get an idea of how is it best to engage with you, what you want to learn more about, what you find difficult to engage with. I'm going to put a 2-minute feedback form into the chat. I realize I'm putting a lot of links in the chat, but that 2-minute feedback form, those 2 minutes at the end of the Zoom call, really help us to look through it and see, okay, what can we work on? What can we change? What do people want to learn more about? How do people want to learn about these things? And how can we take action as well? How are you going to take the information from tonight and to turn it into an action? Is there a group you're going to follow, or is it a case of you're going to mull on it for a while? So please do fill out a 2-minute feedback form to let us learn more. And we do have a read and watch list as well. If anyone wants to take a look through that, you got emailed it with this reminder, but if you want to read more about energy poverty, that's the link there. Thank you so much for coming, and a huge thank you to our speakers for coming and shedding light on so many different issues this evening. And have a lovely evening, everyone. Thanks for joining.
Thank you very much. And street by street, block by block, live and rent will win the lot. And I'll tell you also, Katu will win the lot. So come on, join your union. Get and let's basically fight for justice, fight for climate change. We can do this. Come on, solidarity to your comrades, solidarity to your friends in Ireland.
Thank you so much, Bryce, and solidarity to those in Scotland. Hopefully we'll be seeing you sometime soon.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.